When you picture ancient Rome, what do you see? Gleaming white marble temples reflecting the Mediterranean sun, brilliant minds debating philosophy and law in the grand halls of the Senate, emperors and elite politicians draped in pristine, blindingly white togas that cascade perfectly over their shoulders. The Romans are legendary for their hygiene and their engineering. They built massive, sweeping aqueducts that carried fresh water for miles into the heart of the city. They constructed elaborate public bathhouses with heated floors and vaulted ceilings, and engineered complex sewer systems like the Cloaca Maxima to wash away the city's waste. By all accounts, they were the cleanest and most structurally advanced civilization of the ancient world, but there is a massive, foul-smelling secret hiding just behind all that gleaming white marble and triumphant architecture, a secret so fundamentally disgusting it required a massive specialized workforce, highly specific zoning laws to contain the stench, and a whole lot of human waste. Today, we are diving headfirst, and I mean that literally, into the putrid, fascinating, and deeply disturbing world of the Roman fullonica, the ancient laundromat. By the end of this video, you will never look at a glorious marble statue of Julius Caesar or Augustus the same way again, because to get his clothes that legendary shade of white and to maintain the illusion of absolute purity, thousands of people at the bottom of the social ladder had to do things that would make a modern sanitation worker vomit. Before we get to the genuinely gross part, we have to understand the sheer scale of the problem the Romans were facing and why their laundry situation was a complete nightmare. If you spill ketchup on your shirt today or get sweaty at the gym, you throw your clothes in a machine with some Tide Pods, push a button, and you're done in an hour. But the Romans didn't have washing machines. They didn't have electric dryers. And more importantly, they didn't have true soap. The concept of boiling fats with lye to create sudsy soap wouldn't become popular in Europe for centuries, and they weren't just washing little cotton t-shirts or lightweight synthetic fabrics. The ultimate symbol of Roman citizenship, power, and masculine authority was the toga. But the toga wasn't just a simple bedsheet you wrapped around yourself like you're going to a college frat party. A proper Roman toga was a massive, heavy, semicircular piece of specially woven wool. It could be up to 18 feet long and 11 feet wide. Wrapping it correctly was such a complex, precise art form that wealthy Romans actually had specific enslaved servants whose only job was to fold and arrange their togas every morning. Imagine wearing a heavy, scratchy, 18-foot-long wool blanket. Now, imagine wearing it in the middle of a brutal Italian summer, in a crowded city of 1 million people with no air conditioning. The streets of Rome were a chaotic mess of dust, dirt, chariot wheels kicking up mud, and thick black smoke from thousands of wood-burning cooking fires and blacksmith forges. You are sweating profusely, the city is dirty, and yet you are expected to keep this massive wool garment blindingly perfectly white. In fact, if you were a politician running for office, you wore a specially whitened toga called a toga candida, which is actually where we get the modern English word candidate. If your toga was dingy, dirty, or stained, it was considered a sign of moral failing, and it could literally cost you an election. The fabric itself was the enemy. Wool is naturally full of lanolin, which is a thick, sticky sheep grease. This grease is great for keeping sheep warm and dry, but for human clothing it is a nightmare. It traps dirt, it traps sweat, and it acts like a magnet for the grime of a bustling, smoky ancient city. Water alone isn't going to get that out. You can soak a greasy wool toga in a pure mountain stream for a week, and it will still be dirty. You need a chemical reaction. You need a strong base, a highly alkaline substance, to cut through the acidic grease and bodily oils. So, without modern synthetic detergents, without bleach, and without commercial soap. Where do you find a readily available, completely free, highly alkaline substance in a densely packed city of 1 million people? You look in the chamber pots. That's right. The primary cleaning agent in ancient Rome was human urine, stale, fermented, absolutely vile, ammonia-rich human pee. And they didn't just use a little bit of it for spot treatments. The Roman laundry industry was an industrial-scale operation built entirely on a foundation of liquid gold. These ancient laundries were known as fullonicas, and the men who worked them were called fullones. They were the unsung, utterly filthy heroes of the Roman Empire. Every major city, every town, every military outpost from Britain to North Africa had them. In the ash-buried city of Pompeii alone, archaeologists have unearthed at least 18 different fullonicas, ranging from small, family-run corner shops to massive factory-like industrial complexes taking up entire city blocks. Before we get into the actual physical process of how they did this, which involves stomping on clothes like grapes for wine, let me know down in the comments. If you had to travel back in time, would you rather be a gladiator fighting for your life in the Colosseum, or a fullo washing clothes in a giant steaming vat of urine? Let me know, because honestly, after researching the horrific details of this job, I think I'd take my chances with the lions. Now, you might be thinking, why pee? Of all the things in the natural world, why on earth choose that? Well, it turns out the Romans, despite not having modern science, were accidental master chemists. Fresh urine is mostly water, and a chemical compound called urea. On its own, fresh pee isn't going to clean your toga. It's just going to make it wet and gross. But when you let urine sit around for a few days or weeks, when you let it get nice and stale in the hot Mediterranean sun, bacteria naturally begin to break down that urea. This decay process produces a highly concentrated gas called ammonia. If you've ever used heavy-duty window cleaner or industrial floor cleaner, you know the harsh, stinging, chemical smell of ammonia. It burns your nostrils. It is a powerful alkaline compound, and historically it is absolutely incredible at breaking down grease, sweat, and oils. When a Roman fuller dumped a dirty, sweaty, grease-stained wool tunic into a vat of fermented urine, the naturally occurring ammonia acted exactly like modern laundry detergent. It chemically attacked the lanolin and human sweat, broke it apart on a molecular level, and allowed the dirt to be lifted and washed away. But knowing the chemistry is only half the battle. Actually executing the cleaning process was a physically grueling, violently smelly, and socially stigmatizing job. The fullones didn't have spinning washing machines to agitate the clothes and mix the chemicals. They had their own 2 feet. Next, we are going to look at the daily life of a Roman laundry worker. We'll explore the logistics of gathering millions of gallons of pee, the public jars placed on street corners for donations, the famous emperor who actually put a tax on human waste, and the horrific, squelching reality of the stomping vats. We know that the Romans relied on the ammonia in fermented urine to cut through the grease and dirt of their heavy wool clothing. But this immediately raises a massive logistical question. How do you get enough of it? When you are running an industrial-scale laundry operation that cleans thousands of garments a week, you can't just rely on the workers themselves to provide the necessary chemicals. You need volume. You need a steady, reliable, never-ending supply chain of human waste. The solution was both ingeniously practical and incredibly gross. The Roman laundries essentially crowdsourced their cleaning supplies from the general public. If you walk down the bustling streets of ancient Rome, Pompeii, or Ostia, you wouldn't just see bakeries, blacksmiths, and taverns. Placed strategically on street corners, outside taverns, and in busy public squares, you would find large terracotta clay pots, often with the tops cut off or widened. These were the ancient equivalent of public recycling bins, but instead of plastic bottles, they were meant for liquid donations. If a Roman citizen was walking home from the Forum or leaving a local bar after a few cups of wine and suddenly felt the call of nature, they wouldn't just relieve themselves in a dark alleyway. That was considered bad manners and a waste of a valuable resource. Instead, they would step up to one of these public jars provided by the local fullonica and make their deposit. The laundry owners actively encouraged this. Free urine meant free detergent, but the street corner jars were only one part of the supply chain. Rome was a city of over 1 million people, and it was packed with massive multi-stall public restrooms known as latrines. These public toilets were long marble benches with keyhole-shaped cutouts where dozens of Romans would sit shoulder to shoulder, chatting about politics, sports, and business while they did their business. Beneath these benches, a constant stream of running water carried the solid waste away into the sewer system like the cloaca maxima. However, the liquid waste, the highly prized ammonia-rich urine, was often channeled separately or collected in massive underground cisterns. This created an entirely new, highly specialized, and deeply unpleasant profession: the urine merchant, or, more accurately, the urine collector. Every day, workers from the fullonicas would drive wooden carts pulled by mules through the narrow, crowded streets of the city. They would travel from street corner to street corner, emptying the public pee jars into larger vats on their carts. They would visit the public latrines and pump or scoop out the collected liquid. They would even go door to door to private homes and massive apartment buildings called insulae, paying a small copper coin for the contents of the residents' overnight chamber pots. Imagine the smell. Imagine the sloshing, spilling, splashing reality of driving a wooden cart filled with hundreds of gallons of fermenting, stale urine over bumpy cobblestone streets in the blazing Italian summer heat. The stench must have been absolutely eye-watering. In fact, the smell was so bad that Roman law eventually dictated that the largest fullonicas had to be pushed to the outskirts of towns, or relegated to specific industrial districts, because wealthy neighbors couldn't stand the eye-burning scent of ammonia wafting through their villa windows. This massive liquid supply chain eventually became so organized, so profitable, and so essential to the Roman economy that the imperial government took notice. And where there is profit, there are taxes. This brings us to one of the most famous, and arguably most bizarre, tax policies in human history. In the 1st century A.D., the Roman Empire was in dire financial trouble. Emperor Nero had practically bankrupted the state with his lavish spending, golden palaces, and endless parties. After Nero's death, a brief and chaotic civil war broke out, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. When the dust finally settled, a tough, pragmatic general named Vespasian took the throne. Vespasian inherited a completely empty treasury. He needed money to rebuild the empire, pay the army, and fund his massive new public works project, a giant amphitheater that we know today as the Colosseum. To raise funds, Vespasian instituted a series of aggressive new taxes. He taxed everything he could think of, and then he looked at the booming laundry industry and the millions of gallons of urine changing hands every single day. Vespasian enacted the vectigal urinae, the urine tax. It was a direct tax on the collection and sale of human urine from public latrines. If a fullonica wanted to collect pee from the public baths or street corners, they had to pay a cut to the imperial treasury. As you might expect, this tax was incredibly unpopular. It was considered tacky embarrassing, and beneath the dignity of the Roman Empire. The idea of the emperor enriching himself off the contents of public toilets was a joke to the Roman elite. The historian Suetonius recorded a famous interaction between Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus. Titus, who was worried about his family's reputation, openly criticized his father, complaining that taxing human urine was disgusting and shameful. According to the legend, Vespasian didn't argue. He simply reached into his pouch, pulled out a freshly minted gold coin, and held it right up to his son's nose. "Does it smell?" Vespasian asked. Titus sniffed the coin, shook his head, and replied, "No, father." Vespasian smiled and delivered a punchline that has survived for 2,000 years. "Yet," he said, "it comes from urine." This interaction gave birth to the famous Latin proverb, pecunia non olet. Money doesn't smell. It didn't matter where the revenue came from, as long as it paid the bills and built the Colosseum. The urine tax was a massive success, filling the imperial coffers and proving that the laundry business was a cornerstone of the Roman economy. So the carts have made their rounds. The street jars are empty. The latrines have been drained. Thousands of gallons of stale, fermenting urine have been transported to the fullonica and poured into massive, stone-lined vats. The ammonia is strong enough to make your eyes water from 50 feet away. The liquid is ready. The detergent is primed. Now comes the hardest part. The clothes arrive. Piles and piles of heavy, greasy, sweat-stained wool togas, tunics, and cloaks. They are tossed into the vats. And now someone has to jump in and start the wash cycle. Next, we are going to look at the brutal physical labor of the first wash. We will step into the stomping vats alongside the lowest workers in Rome and explore just how physically exhausting it was to act as a human washing machine. The moment has finally arrived to wash the garments. If you were to walk into a large Roman fullonica, especially one of the sprawling industrial complexes uncovered in the ash-buried ruins of Pompeii, the first thing that would hit you wouldn't just be the smell, it would be the sound. A relentless, rhythmic, wet, squelching sound echoing off the stone and brick walls. This was the sound of the first wash cycle, a brutal physical process that relied entirely on human labor, endless repetition, and a significant amount of human suffering. In the back of the fullonica, strategically placed away from the cleanly swept storefronts where wealthy customers dropped off their pristine garments, was the stomping room. This area was lined with a series of small individual stone stalls or niches separated by low masonry walls. Inside each of these cramped stalls was a terracotta or stone basin set directly into the floor. These were the stomping vats, known in Latin as the saltus fullonicus. When a massive batch of dirty laundry arrived from the carts, the garments were roughly sorted. The heavy wool togas, the sweaty undertunics, the thick winter cloaks, and the soiled blankets, all of them were tossed into these deep floor basins. Then, the workers would take large buckets of the fermented stale urine we talked about earlier, often mixed with a carefully measured amount of water to create a vial. Highly alkaline slurry. They poured this mixture directly over the massive piles of clothes until the heavy wool fabrics were completely submerged, and then the workers stepped in. It is crucial to understand who exactly was doing this work. These laborers were the absolute lowest of the low in the Roman social hierarchy. While the owner of a successful fullonica could be a very wealthy, respected businessman, sometimes even a wealthy freed slave who had bought his way to the top of the local economy, the actual workers standing inside the vats were almost exclusively enslaved people or desperately poor free citizens who had absolutely no other way to survive. They were the invisible, silent underclass of the great empire. There is a profound, Incredibly dark irony in the fact that the blindingly white togas worn by Roman senators and emperors to project an image of absolute purity, moral superiority, and divine authority were literally stomped out by the most oppressed, filthy, and miserable people in their society. The workers would strip down to prepare for the vats. They often worked completely naked or wearing only a simple, tightly tied loincloth, because wearing your own clothing in this humid, splashing environment was entirely pointless. They would step barefoot over the low walls and down into the basins, sinking knee-deep into the cold, squelching mixture of heavy, wet wool and fermented human urine. Once inside, the grueling process began. They didn't just walk casually in place. They performed what historians sometimes grimly refer to as the fuller's dance. This wasn't a matter of guesswork. It is heavily documented in the archaeological record. If you visit the ruins of Pompeii today, you can actually see vibrant, incredibly detailed frescoes painted directly onto the walls of these ancient laundries, such as the famous Fullery of Stephanus or the Fullery of Lucius Veranius Hypsius. These paintings proudly depict the workers in action. The frescoes show the workers holding on to the low side walls of their individual stalls to keep their balance, while others are depicted gripping wooden bars or heavy ropes suspended from the ceiling. Using their entire body weight, they would violently stomp, jump, and twist their feet into the fabric. They had to constantly agitate the massive, tangled pile of clothes, forcing the ammonia-rich liquid deep into the dense, tightly woven fibers of the wool to chemically break apart the trapped lanolin grease, human sweat, and street dirt. Imagine doing this for 10 to 12 hours a day. The physical exertion alone is staggering to think about. Wet wool is incredibly heavy, holding several times its own weight in water. Trying to lift your legs and stomp downward into a thick, tangled mass of soaking wet, heavy blankets is exactly like trying to run through a thick mud swamp. Your calf and thigh muscles would begin to burn intensely within the first few minutes of the shift. Your lower back would ache endlessly from the constant twisting, balancing, and downward pressure, but you couldn't stop to rest. The overseers pacing the floors ensured that the rhythm of the squelching never broke. But the sheer physical exhaustion was only one part of the daily torture. The environmental conditions inside the stomping room were straight out of a nightmare. Italy can get blisteringly hot in the height of the summer, and the stomping rooms were humid, enclosed spaces with minimal ventilation. The ambient heat from the sun and the sheer body heat of dozens of laboring men caused the fermented urine in the vats to evaporate faster, filling the air with a thick, choking, invisible fog of concentrated ammonia gas. If you've ever accidentally taken a deep breath while cleaning a bathroom with a bottle of strong industrial-strength bleach or household ammonia, you know the exact sensation. It immediately burns the back of your throat, makes your lungs spasm, and causes your eyes to instantly water and sting. The fullones were breathing this toxic vapor in all day, every single day. Chronic respiratory issues, violent coughing fits, and long-term lung damage were undoubtedly rampant among the workforce, drastically shortening their lifespans. And then there was the devastating effect on the human skin. Ammonia is a highly alkaline substance, which, as we established, is exactly why it works so perfectly as a degreaser. But human skin relies on a delicate, slightly acidic outer mantle to stay healthy and intact. Standing bare-legged in a highly alkaline bath of fermented bodily fluids for hours on end literally strips away the skin's natural protective oils. The workers' feet, ankles, and calves would become violently red, raw, and painfully cracked. The ammonia would literally begin to chemically burn and slowly dissolve the outer layers of their epidermis. In these horribly unsanitary conditions, even a minor scratch on the ankle or a simple blister from rubbing against the rough wool was a potential disaster. The bacteria from the stale urine and the massive amounts of filth lifted from the dirty clothes would instantly infect any open wounds. Painful conditions like trench foot, severe fungal infections, and chronic weeping chemical burns were not just risks. They were considered a standard part of the job description. Furthermore, as they jumped and stomped, the liquid would naturally splash upward. Getting a single drop of that highly concentrated, bacteria-filled alkaline slurry into your eye could easily lead to severe corneal infections, or even permanent blindness. Yet, day in and day out, the squelching continued. The fullones stomped the garments relentlessly until the ammonia had successfully dissolved the sheep grease and the human grime. But breaking down the grease was only step one of the complex Roman cleaning process. Think about it logically. Even though the grease was now dissolved, the clothes were currently soaking in a dark, sludgy, opaque soup of dirt, sweat, and stale urine. If you pulled a prized toga out of that vat right at that moment, it wouldn't be blindingly white. It would be a dingy, stained, yellowish-brown mess, and it would smell strongly like a public restroom on the hottest day of the year. The first wash had done its primary job of chemical degreasing, but to actually lift the dirt particles away from the wool fibers, to scrub the fabric clean, and to begin the vital process of whitening, the Romans needed to introduce a whole new set of materials into the mix. They needed heavy abrasives. They needed earth, ash, and brimstone. Next, we are going to look at the second major phase of the Roman laundry process. We will explore the massive logistical effort to mine specific types of volcanic clay, how they utilized the ashes of dead animals as a secret cleaning agent, and the intense, labor-heavy scrubbing process that finally started to make those famous Roman togas look presentable again. When the overseers finally signaled the end of the first wash cycle, the squelching in the stomping vats would cease. The exhausted workers, their legs stinging from the highly alkaline ammonia, would stop their grim dance. But if you were to reach into that basin and pull out a prized, expensive wool toga at this exact moment, you would be horrified. The garment wouldn't be blindingly white or fresh. It would be a heavy, dripping, utterly foul-smelling mess, tinted a sickly yellowish brown. It would smell intensely of a sun-baked public restroom. The initial stomping phase had done its job. The ammonia in the stale urine had successfully broken the chemical bonds of the sheep's lanolin, the human sweat, and the greasy street grime. However, that dirt hadn't actually gone anywhere. It was now just suspended in the murky, foul liquid soaking the fabric. The dirt was detached from the wool fibers, but it was still deeply trapped within the heavy folds of the wet garment. The ancient laundromat now had to transition from a chemical degreasing bath to a process of aggressive physical extraction. If urine was the chemical solvent, the Romans now needed a physical sponge and a heavy-duty abrasive to finish the job. For this, they turned to the earth itself. The fullones utilized a highly specialized, naturally occurring substance known in Latin as creta fullonica. Today, we still refer to it by its historical name, fuller's earth. Fuller's earth is not just regular dirt or common garden mud. It is a highly specific type of clay, primarily composed of aluminum and magnesium silicates. It is often found in regions with ancient volcanic activity. What makes this specific clay so incredibly valuable to the ancient laundry industry is its superpower: absolute, unmatched absorption. The molecular structure of Fuller's earth makes it incredibly porous. When you introduce this clay to a porous fabric like wool, it acts exactly like a microscopic hyperabsorbent magnet. It physically bonds to the dissolved greases, oils, and suspended dirt particles, pulling them completely out of the wool fibers and trapping them securely within the clay itself. But Rome couldn't just dig this magical dirt out of the hills behind the city. The highest quality creta fullonica had to be mined and imported. The best clays came from specific geologically rich regions, such as the island of Sardinia, the island of Lemnos in Greece, or the volcanic hills of Umbria in central Italy. Stop and think about the massive, mind-boggling supply chain required for this. The Roman Empire dedicated fleets of cargo ships traversing the Mediterranean Sea and endless convoys of heavy, ox-drawn carts groaning across paved Roman roads, in for the sole purpose of transporting thousands of tons of specialized dirt. They moved mountains of clay across the ancient world just so the political elite and wealthy patricians could have impeccably clean togas. It is a striking testament to how central and economically vital the laundry industry was to the functioning of the empire. However, Fuller's earth was only the primary abrasive. The Fullones were master practical chemists, constantly experimenting to achieve the brightest whites. To increase the cleaning power, add a harsher abrasive grit, and further boost the alkalinity of the wash, they introduced secondary ingredients into the mix: ash and bone. Workers would gather massive quantities of wood ash from the city's bakeries, bathhouse furnaces, and blacksmith forges. When wood ash is mixed with water, it creates a chemical compound called potassium carbonate, widely known as potash. Potash is highly alkaline. In fact, centuries later, boiling animal fats with this exact type of wood ash would become the foundational recipe for creating true, sudsy soap. The Romans hadn't quite figured out the boiling fat part yet, but by aggressively rubbing wet wood ash directly into the garments, they were effectively creating a primitive, highly caustic proto-soap right there on the fabric. In some extreme cases, they even crushed and burned the bones of animals to create an extra coarse, gritty powder that acted like heavy-duty sandpaper on the toughest stains. With the materials prepped, the second agonizing phase of the labor began. The heavy, soaking, wet, urine-drenched garments were hauled out of the floor basins. 2 or 3 workers would have to team up just to lift a single soaking wet 18-foot toga. They heaved the dripping fabric onto massive flat stone tables or into wider, shallower scrubbing troughs lined with rough masonry. Then they took large clay scoops of the powdered fuller's earth, the coarse gray wood ash, and the crushed bone, throwing it generously over the wet fabric. They didn't use delicate, soft-bristled brushes for this. This was a process of violent, repetitive friction. The workers used rough wooden paddles, stiff brushes made from heavy animal hair, or, very often, their own bare hands to aggressively scrub the dry clay and ash mixture deep into the tight weave of the wool. Consider the horrific physical toll of this specific task. The workers' hands and arms were already chemically softened and stripped of natural oils and slightly burned from standing in the ammonia vats all morning. Now they were furiously rubbing coarse volcanic clay, harsh wood ash, and bone grit into heavy, resistant wool. The friction would have been absolutely agonizing. It was essentially the equivalent of rubbing your chemically burned hands with coarse sandpaper for hours on end without a single break. The cuticles would be shredded and infected. The skin over their knuckles would be rubbed completely raw and bloody. Their fingernails would be worn down to the quick. The overseers demanded perfection. The workers had to ensure that every single square inch of the massive garments was thoroughly coated and aggressively scrubbed. The clay had to be worked completely through the front and back of the fabric to guarantee it absorbed all the dissolved bodily oils and trapped grime. They would fold the heavy fabric, scrub, unfold it, apply more ash, and scrub again in an endless back-breaking loop. By the time this grueling skin-shredding process was finally finished, the garments didn't look clean in the slightest. In fact, to a modern observer, they would look infinitely worse than when they first arrived at the fullonica. The bright white togas were now stiff, incredibly heavy, and completely caked in a thick, dark, grayish-brown mud made of volcanic clay, caustic wood ash, trapped street dirt, and stale urine. The chemical and physical extraction phases were complete. The dirt was no longer attached to the wool. It was successfully locked inside the clay. But now, the fullones faced a massive logistical nightmare. How do you get all of that heavy, toxic, foul-smelling mud out of the fabric? You couldn't just brush it off once it dried. You needed water. Not just a bucket or two, but an absolutely staggering, monumental volume of constantly flowing, high-pressure, pure water. Fortunately for the laundry owners, if there was one single thing the Roman Empire was famous for engineering, it was the mass movement of water. Next, we are going to look at the massive rinse cycle. We will explore how these grimy, foul-smelling industrial laundries tapped directly into the pristine, glorious Roman aqueduct system, the exhausting physical process of literally beating the clay out of the clothes, and the horrific environmental disaster created by millions of gallons of toxic, urine-filled wastewater pouring out into the city streets. To remove the thick, toxic mud of volcanic clay, caustic wood ash, and stale human urine from the heavy wool togas, the Roman laundries required a staggering volume of water. We are not talking about a few buckets drawn from a local well or hauled up from a river. To thoroughly rinse out that level of deeply embedded, chemical-soaked grime from thousands of pounds of heavy fabric every single day, a fullonica required a constant, high-pressure, never-ending flowing river. And this brings us to an incredible intersection of advanced Roman engineering and absolute, unadulterated filth. The Roman Empire was the undisputed master of hydrologic engineering. They constructed massive, sweeping aqueducts that transported millions of gallons of fresh, crystal-clear spring water from distant mountain sources directly into the heart of their bustling cities. This precious water supplied the grand public bathhouses, the decorative monumental fountains, and the lavish private villas of the incredibly wealthy. But the fullones, the shrewd laundry owners, also recognized that this endless supply of pressurized water was the absolute key to scaling their businesses from small corner shops into massive, highly profitable industrial complexes. If a fullonica was large enough and its owner was wealthy and influential enough, they wouldn't rely on enslaved workers hauling water by hand from public fountains. Instead, they would legally, or very often illegally, through bribery and unauthorized tapping, connect their facilities directly to the city's main water supply. They used heavy lead pipes, known in Latin as fistulae, to channel this pristine mountain water straight into the back rooms of their grimy, foul-smelling laundries. The rinsing complex inside a large Roman laundry was a marvel of highly efficient, practical design. It was typically constructed as a series of large, interconnected masonry basins or deep stone troughs, meticulously arranged in a descending, cascading sequence. The pure, fresh water from the aqueduct would pour directly into the highest, top-tier basin. As that basin filled, the water would overflow and cascade down into the second basin, then the third, and finally flow out through a large drain at the absolute bottom of the room, which connected directly to the city's sewer system or the open street gutters. This cascading design was ingenious because it created a continuous flow of progressively cleaner water without requiring mechanical pumps. When the exhausted workers hauled the heavy, mud-caked garments out of the scrubbing troughs, they would first dump them into the lowest, dirtiest basin at the bottom of the cascade. This is where the heaviest layers of clay, ash, and trapped dirt would be initially blasted away by the flowing water. But you couldn't just let the clothes sit passively in the running water. The fuller's earth and coarse ash had been aggressively scrubbed and forced deep into the microscopic fibers of the wool. It was practically cemented in there. To get it out, the workers had to subject the garments to a secondary phase of violent physical labor. Workers would stand knee-deep in these cascading pools, wielding heavy, thick wooden bats, stout rods, or flat wooden mallets. As the water rushed over the clothes, the workers would mercilessly beat the fabric. They would heave the heavy, soaking wet wool out of the water, slam it down against flat, angled stone slabs specifically built into the sides of the basins, and strike it repeatedly with their wooden bats to physically force the clay out from between the woven threads. The sensory experience of this room would have been utterly overwhelming. While the ammonia-stomping vats we talked about earlier were hot, humid, and relatively silent, save for the wet squelching of bare feet, the rinsing complex was freezing cold and deafeningly loud. The pristine mountain water flowing directly from the aqueducts was frigid, and chilling the underfed workers to the bone even in the peak of the Italian summer heat. The air would be constantly filled with the sharp, cracking sound of heavy wood violently slamming against wet stone and dense fabric, echoing endlessly off the brick walls. And everywhere there was a relentless, stinging spray of gray, sludgy, foul-smelling water. As the workers beat the garments in the lowest basin, turning the water dark and murky, they would gradually move the clothes up the cascade. They hauled the heavy, waterlogged wool from the bottom basin up to the middle basin, where the water was slightly cleaner, and continued to systematically beat, fold, and pummel the fabric. Finally, the garments were dragged into the top basin, holding them directly under the high-pressure flow of the pure, incoming aqueduct water. Only when the runoff, flowing from the violently beaten wool, was completely perfectly clear could the workers finally put their mallets down. But we have to pause here and consider the massive environmental consequence of this continuous, industrial-scale rinsing process. Think about what was actually flowing out of that bottom drain all day long. Millions of gallons of water were constantly pouring out of the fullonicas. But it was no longer pristine mountain water. It had been transformed into a highly toxic, chemically caustic sludge. This wastewater was a thick, dark gray cocktail composed of dissolved sheep grease, human sweat, street dirt, highly alkaline wood ash, gritty volcanic clay, and, of course, massive quantities of stale, fermented human urine. And where did all of this toxic runoff go? In the best-case scenario, in large, highly developed cities like Rome, it flowed directly into the massive underground sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, eventually dumping straight into the Tiber River, heavily polluting the main fresh waterway of the capital city. But in many smaller towns, or in laundries operating without proper connections to the deep sewers, this horrific, foul-smelling sludge simply poured out of a hole in the side of the building and directly into the open street gutters. The streets of an ancient Roman city were already notoriously filthy, but the immediate vicinity of a major fullonica would have been an absolute environmental nightmare. The sheer volume of gray, urine-tinged mud coating the cobblestones, combined with the ever-present, eye-watering stench of evaporating ammonia, made these laundries highly undesirable neighbors. The smell and the localized pollution were so intensely offensive that Roman authorities eventually had to step in and create some of the first specialized industrial zoning laws in recorded history. In many major cities, massive fullonicas were legally forced to operate strictly on the outskirts of town, placed specifically downwind from the wealthy, sprawling residential districts. In Rome itself, a huge concentration of these laundries was ultimately banished across the Tiber River to the working-class, densely packed district of Trastevere. They were safely separated from the gleaming marble villas of the senators and patricians who relied on them so heavily. The Roman elite demanded perfectly clean clothes to showcase their superiority, but they absolutely refused to look at or smell the horrific industrial process required to achieve them. At this point in the grueling process, the garments had survived the ammonia stomping, the abrasive clay scrubbing, and the violent rinsing cycle. The dirt, the sweat, and the grease were finally gone. If you pulled the heavy, dripping toga from the final basin of clear water, it was, functionally speaking, completely clean. But for a high-ranking Roman politician, a wealthy merchant, or an emperor, simply being clean was nowhere near good enough. The natural color of wool, even when scrubbed perfectly clean and devoid of any dirt, is not blindingly white. It is a dull, off-white, slightly yellowish cream color. To achieve that legendary, brilliant, radiant white that symbolized absolute power, moral purity, and divine status, the fabric had to undergo one final, highly dangerous chemical process. The fullones had to bleach it. Next, we are going to look at the extreme, hazardous lengths the Romans went to in order to artificially whiten their clothes. We will explore the dangerous use of highly flammable brimstone, the massive dome-shaped wicker cages used for toxic fumigation, and the meticulous finishing touches that finally transformed a beaten, wet piece of wool into a symbol of imperial majesty. The heavy, dripping toga has finally been pulled from the frigid, pure waters of the cascading aqueduct rinse cycle. It has been violently beaten against stone slabs until every last microscopic grain of volcanic clay, caustic wood ash, and stale human urine has been blasted out of the wool fibers. If you were to look at the water running off the garment now, it would be crystal clear. The dirt, the sweat, and the sheep grease are completely gone. But as the exhausted workers haul the massive 18-foot length of wet fabric out of the basin, a glaring problem remains. It is not white. Pure, natural wool, even when it has been stripped of its lanolin and scrubbed meticulously clean, does not have a brilliant, blindingly white color. It naturally possesses a dull, slightly yellowish, creamy hue. For a common Roman citizen or a poor laborer, this off-white color was perfectly acceptable. But for the Roman elite, the senators, the patricians, and the emperor himself, an off-white toga was a profound embarrassment. The pristine, radiant whiteness of a garment was a direct visual representation of a man's political power, his immense wealth, and his moral purity. To achieve this impossible, glowing shade of white, the fullones had to subject the fabric to one final, highly dangerous chemical process. They had to bleach it using poison gas. If you were to walk into the open-air courtyard of a major Roman fullonica, you would see strange, dome-shaped structures scattered across the stone floors. They looked like giant, human-sized bird cages or massive woven bell jars. These were called the viminea cavea, frames intricately woven from flexible willow branches or reeds. These simple wicker cages were the centerpiece of the ancient world's most effective and most toxic bleaching operation. The workers would take the damp, freshly rinsed toga and carefully drape it over the outside of the wicker frame, spreading the fabric out so it formed a complete tent over the structure. Then they would place a small terracotta pot directly underneath the cage, resting on the courtyard floor. Inside this pot was a highly volatile yellow mineral that the Romans mined from the active volcanic vents near Mount Vesuvius and the Phlegraean fields. They called it sulfur or brimstone. A worker would ignite the sulfur inside the pot, quickly step back, and let the chemical reaction take over. When sulfur burns, it doesn't just create a flame, it produces a thick, acrid, incredibly pungent gas known as sulfur dioxide. As this gas billowed up from the pot, it was trapped perfectly inside the damp tent of the wool toga. This is where the ancient Romans, entirely by trial and error, mastered a highly complex chemical process. Sulfur dioxide is what modern chemists call a reducing bleaching agent. As the heavy gas seeped into the damp wool, it actively interacted with the naturally occurring color pigments inside the fibers. The sulfur dioxide literally stripped the oxygen atoms away from those pigment molecules. By breaking these chemical bonds, the gas rendered the yellow pigments completely colorless. As the sulfur burned, the dull, creamy wool draped over the cage would slowly, miraculously transform into a brilliant, gleaming, icy white. But this chemical miracle came at a terrifying cost to human health. Sulfur dioxide is an incredibly toxic gas. It is the exact same noxious fume that billows out of erupting volcanoes. If you have ever smelled it, it smells intensely of rotten eggs mixed with the sharp, choking scent of a freshly struck match. But the smell was the least of the workers' problems. When sulfur dioxide gas comes into contact with moisture, it undergoes another chemical reaction, transforming into sulfurous acid. Now, imagine being an enslaved worker in that courtyard. You are constantly breathing in this gas. The moment the sulfur dioxide hits the natural moisture of your eyes, it turns into acid, causing a violent, stinging, blinding pain. When you inhale the gas, it hits the moist lining of your throat and lungs, literally creating microscopic pools of acid inside your respiratory system. The workers tasked with managing the bleaching cages would have suffered from chronic, agonizing chemical burns to their lungs. They would have experienced violent fits of coughing, sometimes coughing up blood. Long-term exposure to sulfur dioxide leads directly to severe asthma, chronic bronchitis, and a horrific scarring of the lung tissue. The radiant white garments of the Roman Senate were quite literally bought with the ruined lungs and early painful deaths of the fullones. Furthermore, this process was an absolute logistical nightmare and a massive fire hazard. The fullones were draping hundreds of pounds of heavy, drying wool directly over an open, burning chemical fire. If the wind shifted abruptly, or if a tired worker draped the fabric too loosely and it slipped through the wicker cage, the entire toga would instantly burst into flames. Because of this, the bleaching courtyards had to be constantly, vigilantly monitored, adding an extreme level of stress to an already grueling workday. For the highest tier of Roman society, particularly ambitious politicians, even the sulfur bleaching wasn't enough. If a Roman patrician was running for public office, he needed to stand out in the crowded forum. He needed his toga to gleam so brightly in the Mediterranean sun that it practically blinded his constituents. For these specific clients, the fullones utilized a process called chalking. While the wool was still slightly damp from the sulfur cages, workers would take large blocks of a highly prized, ultra-fine white clay known as Umbrian earth. They would aggressively rub this pure white chalk directly into the damp fibers of the toga. Once it dried, the garment was coated in a fine, powdery, impossibly white residue. A man wearing this chalked garment was known as a candidatus, literally meaning one who is clothed in dazzling white. This is exactly where our modern English word candidate comes from. At this point, the garment was perfectly clean and blindingly white. But after surviving the ammonia-stomping vats, the violent wooden mallets, the abrasive volcanic ash, and the toxic sulfur gas, the texture of the wool was absolutely ruined. It was stiff, hopelessly matted, and incredibly scratchy. If a senator tried to wear a toga straight off the bleaching cage, it would chafe his skin raw within minutes. The fabric needed to be softened, and the microscopic surface fibers needed to be raised to create a luxurious, velvety texture. To solve this, the Fullones employed one of the most bizarre tools in the ancient world. They didn't use brushes made of horsehair or boar bristles. They used the dried, stretched skins of actual hedgehogs. These tools, known as the echinus, were wooden blocks covered in the spiky skins of hedgehogs, or sometimes covered in the dried, prickly heads of a specific plant called a teasel. The workers would stretch the massive white toga tightly across a wooden frame and meticulously drag these hedgehog brushes across the surface of the wool, always pulling in one single uniform direction. The sharp, rigid spines would catch the matted, tangled threads, pulling them up and separating them. This process, known as carding or raising the nap, instantly transformed the stiff, abused wool into a thick, incredibly soft, luxurious fleece. Finally, the toga had to be pressed. A Roman patrician would never be caught dead in a wrinkled garment, but the Romans didn't have hot iron plates to smooth out wrinkles. Instead, they relied on massive mechanical force. In the final room of the fullonica stood the prelum, a colossal room-sized wooden screw press. The softened, brushed toga was meticulously folded into perfect sharp pleats. It was then placed between two massive flat wooden planks inside the press. Two strong workers would grab the heavy wooden hand cranks and begin to turn the massive central screw, lowering the top plank. They would tighten the press until thousands of pounds of crushing pressure were applied to the folded fabric. The toga would be left in this wooden vise overnight, locking the crisp, sharp creases perfectly into the dense wool. Before the garment was finally unwrapped, wealthy clients would often pay extra to have the fabric heavily sprinkled with expensive imported perfumes, lavender water, or crushed rose petals. This wasn't just for luxury. It was a desperate, necessary final step to mask the faint, lingering phantom odors of stale urine and burning sulfur that might still be clinging to the threads. When the pristine, perfectly folded, beautifully scented toga was finally delivered to the sprawling villa of its owner, there was absolutely no trace left of the horrific journey it had just taken. The patrician would wrap himself in a symbol of divine purity, completely detached from the squelching vats of ammonia, the shredded hands, and the bleeding lungs that made his elegance possible. But the heavy wool toga was only one part of the Roman wardrobe. While the politicians demanded brilliant whites, the massive population of Rome was wearing a vast array of tunics, undergarments, cloaks, and strange new fabrics pouring in from the edges of the empire, and the Fullones had to figure out how to clean all of it. Next, we are going to dive into the everyday Roman wardrobe. We will look at what the common people were wearing, the vibrant, bleeding dyes that turned the laundry vats into a nightmare of ruined colors, and the sudden, disruptive arrival of a delicate, impossibly expensive fabric from the East that the brutal Roman laundries had absolutely no idea how to wash. Silk. The blindingly white toga was the ultimate symbol of Roman power, but it was hardly the only thing the ancient laundries had to wash. In fact, if you were to stand on a busy street corner in the heart of Rome during the 1st century A.D., you wouldn't see a sea of pristine white wool. The toga was cumbersome, heavy, and completely impractical for daily labor. It was essentially the ancient equivalent of a tuxedo. You wore it to the Senate, to court, or for official religious duties, and the moment you got home, you took it off. The true, everyday uniform of the Roman Empire, worn by absolutely everyone from the lowest enslaved laborer to the emperor himself while lounging at home, was the tunic. The tunic was the foundational garment of antiquity. It was essentially a long, oversized T-shirt, typically belted at the waist, falling to the knees for men and to the ankles for women. Because the tunic was worn directly against the skin every single day, it absorbed the vast majority of the body's sweat, dead skin cells, and natural oils. The fullones were washing tens of thousands of these garments every week. While heavy wool was the most common material for winter tunics, the blistering Mediterranean summers demanded something lighter. By the late Republic and early Empire, Rome had established a massive, thriving trade network with Egypt, and with that trade came ships loaded with vast quantities of linen. Linen is woven from the fibers of the flax plant. Unlike wool, which is an animal protein, linen is a plant-based cellulose fiber. It is incredibly breathable, lightweight, and perfect for hot weather. But for the Roman laundry worker, linen presented a completely different set of chemical and physical challenges. Wool is incredibly resilient when it comes to being violently beaten and stretched. It can bounce back. Linen, however, is much more rigid. When it is soaking wet, linen actually becomes stronger, which meant it could survive the heavy wooden mallets of the rinsing basins. But it was highly susceptible to severe abrasion. If the fullones scrubbed a fine Egyptian linen tunic too aggressively with the coarse volcanic fuller's earth and crushed animal bone we talked about earlier, the sharp grit would slice right through the delicate plant fibers, literally shredding the garment to pieces. Furthermore, while the ammonia in the urine vats was great at breaking down the lanolin grease in wool, linen doesn't have lanolin. It just traps dirt. The fullones had to constantly adjust their chemical mixtures using slightly less harsh alkaline solutions and relying much more heavily on the toxic sulfur-bleaching cages to get the linen tunics brilliantly white. But not everyone wanted white. One of the greatest misconceptions about the ancient Roman world is that everything was made of stark white marble and white fabric. In reality, the streets of Rome were an explosion of vibrant, saturated colors. The Romans were absolutely obsessed with brightly dyed clothing. They wore tunics and cloaks in deep shades of saffron yellow, vibrant madder red, rich woad blue, and forest green. Wealthy women wore intricately draped garments called stolas, dyed in complex patterns and brilliant hues. For the modern laundromat, washing colored clothes is fairly simple. You just wash them in cold water to prevent the synthetic dyes from running. For the ancient Roman fullonica, washing dyed garments was an absolute nightmare and a massive financial liability. The Romans did not have synthetic, perfectly color-fast dyes. They relied entirely on natural dyes extracted from crushed roots, boiled leaves, insects, and tree bark. These organic dyes were chemically bound to the wool or linen using a substance called a mordant, usually a metallic salt like alum. The problem is that these natural dye bonds are incredibly fragile, and many of them are highly sensitive to sudden shifts in pH levels. Now, remember the primary cleaning agent the Romans were using: stale, fermented human urine. Ammonia is a highly alkaline substance with a very high pH. When you drop a tunic dyed with natural red madder root into a vat of highly concentrated ammonia, the alkaline liquid immediately attacks the chemical bond of the dye. It acts as a powerful solvent. The dye physically bleeds out of the fabric and directly into the wash water. Imagine the sheer panic of an enslaved fuller tasked with sorting the day's laundry. If a careless worker accidentally threw a bright red tunic and a dark blue cloak into the same stomping vat as a pile of plain, undyed tunics, the results would be catastrophic. The ammonia would strip the colors, turning the entire vat of urine into a muddy, purple-brown soup. Every single garment in that basin would be permanently ruined, stained with a splotchy, irreversible tie-dye effect. Because of this, the larger industrial fullonicas had to be incredibly meticulous. They maintained completely separate stomping vats specifically reserved for colored garments. The workers in these colored vats couldn't use the hottest, most fermented ammonia-rich urine because it would strip the clothes bare. They had to dilute the mixture heavily, meaning they had to rely on even more aggressive, the exhausting physical stomping and beating to get the dirt out without destroying the expensive colors. And then, during the height of the Roman Empire, a new fabric arrived in the capital that struck sheer terror into the hearts of the laundry owners. It came from across the known world, traveling thousands of miles along incredibly dangerous trade routes from a mysterious, almost mythical land the Romans called Serica, the land of silk. Silk was a revelation to the Romans. It was impossibly thin, practically weightless, and possessed a natural, shimmering luster that no wool or linen could ever replicate. It was also staggeringly, astronomically expensive, literally worth its weight in solid gold. It became the ultimate status symbol for the ultra-wealthy patrician class. Emperor Elagabalus famously horrified conservative Roman traditionalists by wearing garments made entirely of pure imported silk. But when these staggeringly expensive silk garments inevitably got dirty and smelled of sweat, they were sent to the fullonica, and the fullones had absolutely no idea what to do with them. Silk is an animal protein spun by silkworms, but it is microscopic in its fineness. If you took a delicate, translucent silk scarf and threw it into the standard Roman laundry process, it would be utterly annihilated. The highly alkaline fermented urine would instantly dissolve the delicate protein fibers, turning the silk into a slimy, melted paste. The coarse volcanic clay and wood ash would rip it to shreds in seconds. And if you put silk anywhere near the toxic sulfur dioxide bleaching cages, the harsh acid would cause the fabric to turn a sickly, permanent yellow and disintegrate upon touch. To handle this terrifyingly expensive new fabric, the most elite laundries in Rome had to pioneer entirely new specialized cleaning methods. They couldn't use pee and they couldn't use ash. Instead, historians believe they turned to a gentler botanical solution, a plant known as Saponaria officinalis, commonly called soapwort. When the roots and leaves of the soapwort plant are crushed and aggressively agitated in water, they release natural chemical compounds called saponins. These saponins create a mild, bubbly lather that acts as a gentle, non-alkaline surfactant, essentially a natural, weak proto-soap. The elite silk washers wouldn't stomp the fabric. They would meticulously, yet gently hand-wash the silk garments in basins of cool water and crushed soapwort, carefully pressing the dirt out without twisting or stretching the delicate threads. The stress of this specific job must have been unimaginable. If a worker accidentally tore a senator's wife's silk stola, the cost of replacing it was more than the worker would earn in several lifetimes. The punishment for such a mistake would be swift, brutal, and physically devastating. We know all of these intricate, hyper-specific details about the Roman laundry process, not just from ancient texts, but because we have actually found these laundries perfectly preserved in the modern day. We don't just have to guess how they were laid out. We can literally walk through their front doors. Next, we are going to travel back to the fateful year of 79 AD. We will step into the ash-buried city of Pompeii to explore the famous Fullery of Stephanus, a massive, thriving laundry business that was frozen in time, capturing the brutal reality, the incredible architecture, and the doomed workers of the Roman laundry industry in the exact moment of their destruction. To truly understand the visceral reality of the ancient Roman laundry industry, we don't have to rely solely on dusty, fragmented texts written by disgusted patricians. We can actually walk right through the front door of a working fullonica. We can stand in the stomping vats, look at the drying racks, and examine the actual tools of the trade. This incredible window into the past is only possible because of one of the most famous and devastating natural disasters in human history. In the late summer, or possibly the early autumn, of 79 A.D., Mount Vesuvius violently erupted. The sky turned black, the sun was blotted out, and a terrifying avalanche of superheated gas, pumice, and volcanic ash completely buried the thriving, bustling city of Pompeii. While the eruption was an apocalyptic tragedy for the people living there, it was a miraculous gift to modern archaeologists. The volcanic ash acted as a massive, instantaneous time capsule. It didn't just preserve the grand temples and the gladiatorial arenas. It perfectly preserved the mundane, everyday, working-class reality of the Roman Empire. And right in the heart of this frozen city, situated on one of the busiest, wealthiest commercial streets, known as the Via dell'Abbondanza, researchers unearthed a massive, fully operational laundry complex. It is known today as the Fullery of Stephanus. Stephanus was the owner of this establishment, and his story perfectly encapsulates the bizarre social dynamics of the Roman laundry business. Historians strongly suspect that Stephanus was a freedman, a former enslaved person who had managed to buy his freedom or had been granted it by his master. In the rigid social hierarchy of Rome, a freedman could never become a senator or hold high political office, no matter how rich he became. But he could go into business, and Stephanus chose one of the most brutally unglamorous yet spectacularly profitable businesses available. He didn't just build a small, modest shop. He took over a sprawling, elegant, pre-existing patrician mansion, a classic Roman domus, and aggressively retrofitted it into a massive, highly efficient industrial sweatshop. Walking into the Fullery of Stephanus today is a study in jarring contrasts. The front doors of the building opened incredibly wide directly onto the bustling main street, designed to invite maximum foot traffic. Right at the entrance, in plain view of everyone walking by, Stephanus positioned a massive, towering wooden screw press, the pralum we discussed earlier. This wasn't just practical placement. It was a brilliant piece of ancient marketing. Anyone walking past his shop would instantly see the crisp, perfectly pressed, dazzlingly white togas of his wealthiest clients sitting in the machine. It served as a massive silent billboard advertising the elite quality of his work. If you walked past the pressing machine and entered the main atrium of the house, the industrial transformation became even more apparent. In a standard Roman luxury villa, the atrium was a beautiful, serene reception room. It featured an opening in the roof to let in sunlight and fresh air, and directly below that opening was an elegant, shallow marble pool called an impluvium, designed to catch rainwater. Stephanus looked at this beautiful architectural feature and saw only industrial utility. He built a high, thick masonry wall completely around the elegant marble pool, effectively turning the centerpiece of the house into an enormous, heavy-duty soaking vat for washing the largest, heaviest wool garments. The original walls of this atrium were still covered in beautiful, intricate, high-quality frescoes, vibrant paintings of mythological scenes and lush gardens. But Stephanus clearly didn't care about the art. The constant, overwhelming humidity from the soaking vat, combined with the splashing, caustic, alkaline water, would have begun to slowly ruin and peel the beautiful paintings. To the owner of a fullonica, aesthetic beauty always took a back seat to the relentless pursuit of volume and profit. But the true nightmare of the Fullery of Stephanus was located in the back of the house, where the elegant open-air garden courtyard, the peristyle, used to be. Stephanus had completely ripped out the garden, the fountains, and the flowers. In their place, he installed the brutal, squelching heart of his operation. Archaeologists excavated 3 large, deep, interconnected masonry basins here, fed by lead pipes, which served as the cascading rinse cycle. Directly adjacent to these basins, cut deep into the floor, were 5 smaller, distinct oval tubs. These were the saltus fullonicus, the stomping vats. Standing in the ruins of the back courtyard today, you can vividly imagine the scene on the morning of the eruption. You can almost see the 5 enslaved workers, stripped bare, standing knee-deep in a sickening mixture of stale urine, fuller's earth, and heavy wool, balancing themselves against the low masonry walls as they violently stomped the fabric. You can imagine the air, thick and choking with the eye-watering stench of evaporated ammonia and the sweat of exhausted men, completely trapped within the high walls of the former garden. Stephanus had even capitalized on the vertical space. The flat roof of the peristyle had been converted into a massive open-air drying terrace. Workers would have to haul the heavy, soaking wet, freshly rinsed garments up narrow flights of stairs to hang them in the hot Campanian sun. The upper floors also contained cramped, miserable living quarters, strongly suggesting that the enslaved workforce rarely, if ever, left the premises. They lived, slept, and died entirely within the foul-smelling confines of the laundry. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, the bustling activity of the fullonica came to a terrifying sudden halt. As the sky rained down burning pumice stones and the air filled with toxic, suffocating ash, panic erupted in the streets. Most of the citizens of Pompeii fled toward the sea, desperately hoping for a rescue that would never come. But inside the foolery of Stephanus, a very different, much darker drama played out. When modern archaeologists began to carefully excavate the layers of hardened ash near the front entrance of the laundry, right by the heavy wooden doors that led out to the street, they found the skeletal remains of a victim. We don't know for absolute certain if this was Stephanus himself or perhaps his most trusted manager. But we know what they were doing in their final moments. Next to the skeleton, resting on the floor where it had fallen from their desperate grip, was a leather bag. Inside the bag, archaeologists discovered a massive, staggering fortune. It contained over 1,000 individual coins, a massive hoard of silver denarii and gleaming gold aurae. As the mountain exploded and the city began to burn and suffocate around them, this person had refused to run. Instead, they had rushed into the back rooms, desperately gathered the accumulated profits of the laundry business, and tried to flee with the heavy bag of cash. They made it as far as the front door before the toxic gases and falling ash finally overtook them, burying them and their wealth for nearly 2,000 years. That bag of gold and silver tells us everything we need to know about the paradox of the Roman laundry. The physical process was disgusting. The labor was agonizing. The smell was so offensive it had to be legislated. But the people who owned the vats, the men who controlled the supply of urine and ash, were getting incredibly, wildly rich. Next, we are going to look at the powerful economics of the ancient laundry industry. We will explore the massive, highly organized guilds the fullones formed, how they effectively established monopolies over the city's cleanliness, and how the people who washed the emperor's underwear wielded surprising political power in the streets of Rome. We left off looking at the staggering wealth found in the ruins of the foolery of Stephanus, perfectly preserved beneath the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius. That heavy leather bag filled with gold and silver coins wasn't an anomaly, and Stephanus was not just a lucky businessman. The fortune he died trying to protect was a perfect representation of the iron grip the fullones held over the Roman economy. In the ancient world, cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness. It was a highly lucrative, heavily guarded, and ruthlessly enforced monopoly. To understand how the men who managed vats of stale urine became some of the most powerful business owners in Rome, you have to look at the captive market they controlled. Rome was an empire utterly obsessed with outward appearances, social hierarchy, and strict dress codes. By law and custom, you were required to wear specific garments to denote your social class. If you were a senator, you wore a bright white toga with a thick purple stripe. If you were an equestrian, a knight, you wore a narrow purple stripe. The millions of everyday citizens wore standard tunics, and absolutely none of these people had the space, the clean water, the imported volcanic clay, or the toxic chemicals required to clean these massive, heavy garments inside their own cramped, dark apartment buildings. Washing your own clothes at home simply wasn't an option for the vast majority of the urban Roman population. You had to outsource it. The fullones were providing a mandatory service in a densely packed city of over 1 million people. When you provide a service that everyone is socially forced to buy and no one can do themselves, you essentially hold the keys to the city. But the laundry owners didn't just operate as isolated, independent mom-and-pop shops competing against one another in a free market. They organized. They formed massive, highly structured, fiercely protective trade associations known as collegia. A Roman collegium was essentially a cross between a modern labor union, a powerful trade guild, and a slightly menacing mafia family. The laundry owners formed the Collegium Fullinum, the Guild of the Fullers. If you wanted to run a successful fullonica in a major Roman city, you didn't just hang a sign outside your door, you had to join the guild, so pay your dues and strictly adhere to their rules. By organizing into a single unified block, the Fullers Guild was able to completely monopolize the bizarre, incredibly complex supply chain required to clean clothes. Think back to the urine carts roaming the streets. A single, independent laundry owner couldn't possibly negotiate the rights to collect human waste from every public bathhouse or secure the massive government contracts to tap into the high-pressure aqueducts. But the Collegium Fullinum could. The guild negotiated directly with the imperial government and the city magistrates. They secured exclusive rights to the public latrines. They pooled their money to buy entire cargo ships full of the highly prized fuller's earth from the islands of Greece and Sardinia, on importing it in bulk and distributing it only to their official members. Because the guild controlled all the raw materials, the pea, the clay, the ash, and the water, they also controlled the prices. There was massive, widespread price fixing across the industry. The fullones could collectively agree to raise the price of bleaching a toga right before a major political election, knowing perfectly well that the desperate politicians had absolutely no choice but to pay whatever was demanded. They became so wealthy, so organized, and so notorious for price gouging that the imperial government eventually had to step in. Centuries after the eruption of Vesuvius, the Emperor Diocletian issued a massive empire-wide law called the Edict on Maximum Prices. It was a desperate attempt to curb runaway inflation and stop powerful guilds from bleeding the citizens dry. In this incredibly detailed document, Diocletian legally capped exactly what a fuller could charge. According to the edict, washing a thick, heavy winter cloak was capped at 40 denarii. Washing a standard, everyday tunic was capped at 20 denarii. To put that in perspective, a standard Roman laborer might only earn 25 denarii for an entire day of backbreaking work. This meant a common worker might have to spend nearly a full day's wages just to get a single tunic washed. The profit margins for the laundry owners were absolutely astronomical, but the power of the Collegium Fullonum extended far beyond just economics. They weaponized their wealth to buy immense political influence. We know this for a fact because the walls of Pompeii are covered in literal, physical proof. When archaeologists excavated the streets of Pompeii, they didn't just find buildings and bodies, they found thousands of political campaign posters painted in bright red and black letters directly onto the plaster walls of the city. These are known as programmata. In a modern election, a candidate might be endorsed by a police union or a teachers' association. In ancient Pompeii, the most highly sought-after political endorsement came from the men who washed the clothes. On the walls near the massive laundries, archaeologists have translated dozens of these political slogans. One prominent piece of graffiti reads, "The fullers ask you to elect Lucius Papidius Secundus as aedile." Another proclaims, "The fullers unanimously urge the election of Holconius Priscus as Duumvir." The Duumvirs and aediles were the highest-ranking political officials in the city, in charge of everything from maintaining the public roads and the crucial water supply to regulating the street markets. These politicians desperately needed the financial backing of the wealthy laundry owners to fund their campaigns and their public gladiatorial games. In return, when these politicians got elected, they made sure the fullonicaes were perfectly protected. They ensured the laundries had uninterrupted access to the aqueducts, turned a blind eye to the toxic, sludgy wastewater being dumped into the streets, and protected the guild's lucrative monopolies. It was a perfect symbiotic circle of corruption. The politicians needed the fullers' money to gain power, and the fullers needed the politicians' power to protect their money. Despite the fact that their daily work involved wading through vats of fermented human waste and breathing toxic sulfur gas, the laundry owners viewed themselves as highly respected, vital pillars of Roman society. They even had their own patron deity. The Collegium Fullonum worshipped Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and, most importantly, the patroness of crafts and weaving. Every year in the middle of March, the Fullers' Guild threw a massive multi-day religious festival dedicated to Minerva, known as the Quinquatrus. During this festival, the brutal, disquelching labor of the stomping vats finally stopped. The wealthy laundry owners, the free workers, and possibly even some of the enslaved laborers would dress in their absolute finest, brilliantly white, freshly chalked tunics. They would proudly carry the symbol of their guild, an owl, the sacred bird of Minerva, and march through the streets of Rome in massive, highly visible parades. They held lavish banquets, offered expensive animal sacrifices at the grand temples, and publicly celebrated their vital role in maintaining the civilized veneer of the Roman Empire. It is a profound, deeply jarring irony. The men who spent their lives knee-deep in the absolute worst filth the ancient world had to offer were simultaneously funding the political elections, dominating the local economy, and parading through the streets honoring the goddess of wisdom. However, this immense wealth and political power was concentrated entirely in the hands of the owners, the men like Stephanus, who sat in the front office counting the gold. For the thousands of invisible, nameless workers laboring in the dark, humid, chemical-choked back rooms of the fullonica, there was no wealth, no political influence, and certainly no glory. For them, the laundry was a house of endless suffering, disease, and slow death. Next, we are going to look closely at the horrific medical reality of working in an ancient Roman laundry. We will explore the specific occupational hazards that destroyed the bodies of the fullones, from the corrosive rotting of trench foot to the blinding agony of ammonia burns, and the devastating, invisible infections that swept through the squelching vats. We've talked about the gold, the guilds, and the political power of the laundry owners. We've seen the lavish parades honoring the goddess of wisdom, and the carefully pressed, brilliant white togas worn by the Roman elite. But that glittering world of wealth and prestige was built directly on top of a horrific foundation of human suffering. To truly understand the Roman laundry industry, we have to strip away the gold coins and the political endorsements and look at the physical bodies of the people actually doing the work. For the enslaved men and women forced to labor in the back rooms of the fullonica, this wasn't a business. It was a slow, agonizing, and highly toxic death sentence. Working in an ancient Roman laundry was one of the most medically devastating jobs in the ancient world. The occupational hazards were so severe and the working conditions so uniquely toxic that a worker's body would begin to break down almost immediately. Let's start from the ground up, right where the most brutal labor took place, inside the stomping vats. Imagine standing barefoot for 10 to 12 hours a day in a deep stone basin. You are submerged up to your knees in a dark, sludgy mixture of fermented human urine, coarse volcanic clay, caustic wood ash, and the accumulated sweat, dirt, and grease of thousands of strangers. The first and most immediate medical crisis these workers faced was the catastrophic destruction of their skin. Human skin is naturally slightly acidic, protected by a microscopic layer called the acid mantle. This layer is crucial for keeping moisture in and keeping dangerous bacteria out. But as we've discussed, the entire chemical premise of the Roman laundry relied on highly alkaline substances. The ammonia from the stale urine and the potash from the wood ash are incredibly strong bases. When the workers stood in these vats hour after hour, the alkaline liquid violently attacked their skin, instantly neutralizing the acid mantle and literally dissolving the skin's natural protective oils. Without those protective oils, the skin on the workers' feet, ankles, and calves would quickly dry out, become violently inflamed, and begin to crack open. These weren't just simple dry skin flakes. These were deep, agonizing, bleeding fissures. To make matters worse, they were simultaneously jumping and stomping on rough, heavy wool mixed with coarse volcanic grit. The abrasive clay acted like liquid sandpaper, constantly grinding away the softened, chemically burned epidermis. Their legs would be rubbed raw, exposing the sensitive underlying tissues to the highly toxic bath. And that toxic bath was a perfect breeding ground for disease. By stripping the skin of its defenses and creating open, bleeding cracks, the alkaline water provided a direct entry point for millions of microscopic pathogens. Remember, this liquid was heavily composed of human waste, mixed with the filth washed off the streets of Rome. Because their feet were constantly submerged in this filthy, bacteria-laden moisture, the workers suffered from severe, ancient equivalents of what we now call trench foot. Their skin would literally begin to rot and die from continuous exposure to the damp, unsanitary conditions. Aggressive fungal infections would take root under their torn fingernails and toenails. Deep tissue bacterial infections, like cellulitis, were rampant. Without modern antibiotics, a simple infected blister on a fuller's heel could easily lead to gangrene, systemic blood poisoning, amputation, or a slow, agonizing death. But the horrors were not just contained to the skin and feet. The environmental conditions inside the fullonica effectively weaponized the air they breathed. The stomping rooms were hot, enclosed, heavily humid spaces. As the sun beat down and the heat of dozens of laboring bodies warmed the vats, the fermented urine evaporated rapidly. This filled the air with a thick, invisible, choking fog of concentrated ammonia vapor. Breathing in ammonia gas is violently irritating to the human respiratory system. It immediately burns the mucous membranes in the nose and throat. For the fullones, who were forced to take deep, gasping breaths due to the sheer physical exhaustion of stomping heavy wool, the ammonia vapor was pulled deep into their lungs. This constant daily exposure caused severe chemical bronchitis, chronic asthma, and a slow scarring of the delicate lung tissue. The workers would have been plagued by endless, hacking coughs, constantly trying to clear their chemically burned airways. And if the ammonia vapor in the stomping room was bad, the air in the bleaching courtyard was exponentially worse. As we covered earlier, the workers used burning sulfur to bleach the high-end togas. The sulfur dioxide gas trapped under those wicker cages was lethally toxic. When the workers leaned over the burning pots, or when the wind shifted and blew the gas into their faces, the sulfur dioxide mixed with the natural moisture in their lungs and instantly transformed into sulfurous acid. They were literally breathing in vaporized acid, destroying their lung capacity piece by piece. Coughing up blood would have been a common, terrifying occurrence in the courtyard. Then there were the eyes. The human eye is incredibly sensitive to alkaline chemical burns. In the stomping vats, dozens of men were violently jumping and thrashing around in pools of concentrated ammonia. The liquid was constantly splashing upward. If a single drop of that highly alkaline, bacteria-filled slurry landed in a worker's eye, it would immediately begin to dissolve the corneal tissue. Without immediate access to massive amounts of clean, flushing water, which was usually reserved strictly for the rinsing basins, not for the slaves, a splash to the face could cause excruciating pain, severe corneal ulcerations, and permanent, irreversible blindness. Finally, we have to consider the biological hazards of the clothes themselves. Rome was a densely populated, disease-ridden city. It was constantly swept by plagues, fevers, and parasites. When a massive pile of dirty laundry was dumped onto the floor of the fullonica, the workers had no idea what they were handling. They were sorting through the sweat-soaked tunics of people dying from dysentery, cholera, or typhoid. They were handling blankets infested with lice, fleas, and bedbugs. In an era long before the germ theory of disease was understood, the enslaved laundry workers were on the absolute front lines of every single biological outbreak that swept through the Roman Empire. They handled the infected fabrics with their bare, chemically shredded hands, breathing in the dust and the dander of a million sick citizens. For the wealthy owners like Stephanus, none of this mattered. Enslaved labor in ancient Rome was brutally cheap. If a worker went completely blind from an ammonia splash, or if their lungs finally gave out from the sulfur gas, or if they died from a gangrenous infection in their legs, the owner simply threw their body into an unmarked mass grave outside the city walls and bought a replacement worker at the market the very next day. The physical destruction of these workers was complete and absolute. But their suffering wasn't just physical, it was also social. The smell of the vats clung to their skin and hair, impossible to wash off. They carried the stench of the fullonica with them wherever they went, marking them as the absolute lowest untouchables in a society obsessed with status. Next, we are going to explore the intense social stigma surrounding the Roman laundry workers. We will look at how the rest of Roman society viewed the fullones, the vicious insults hurled at them by ancient poets, and the profound, deeply hypocritical class divide between the filthy rich who demanded pure white clothes and the filthy poor who were forced to provide them. We have established the horrific physical toll the Roman laundry industry took on the bodies of its workers, but the devastation did not stop at chemical burns, ruined lungs, and rotting feet. In the ancient Roman world, your physical appearance and, crucially, how you smelled, dictated your entire social existence. For the men and women who labored in the stomping vats, the most inescapable occupational hazard was the stench. It was a profound, deeply ingrained odor that clung to them like a second skin, permanently branding them as the lowest of the low. You could not simply wash off the smell of a fullonica. When a person spends 12 hours a day standing waist-deep in a steaming vat of stale, fermented human urine, aggressively scrubbing caustic wood ash into wool, and breathing in the acrid, rotten egg fumes of burning sulfur, those chemicals physically permeate their body. The sulfur dioxide settled permanently into their hair. The highly alkaline ammonia seeped deep into the pores of their chemically softened, cracked skin. Even their breath would have carried the faint, sickly, sweet phantom odor of the decay they worked in. When their grueling shift finally ended, and they stepped out of the laundry into the streets of Rome or Pompeii, they carried the fullonica with them. They were socially marked by their stench. To understand how devastating this was, you have to understand the rigid, unforgiving nature of the Roman social hierarchy. Roman society was utterly obsessed with a concept called dignitas, a complex combination of personal dignity, social standing, honor, and public respect. Dignitas was everything. It determined who you could marry, where you could sit in the gladiatorial amphitheater, and how the legal system treated you. At the absolute top of this pyramid were the patricians and the senators, men of ancient bloodlines and massive inherited wealth. At the bottom were the enslaved. But even among the enslaved and the poor working-class plebeians, there was a strict, unspoken pecking order based entirely on your profession. If you were an enslaved person working as a tutor in a wealthy household, or a scribe copying Greek philosophy, you held a certain degree of respect. If you were an artisan, a blacksmith, a baker, or a carpenter, you had a recognized honorable trade. But if you were a fuller, you were considered the absolute bottom of the barrel. You were viewed as a necessary but deeply revolting untouchable. This created a profound, deeply ingrained hypocrisy at the very core of the Roman Empire. The senators and the patrician elite demanded absolute physical purity. They required their massive wool togas to be blindingly, impossibly white to project an aura of divine cleanliness, intellectual superiority, and moral authority to the unwashed masses. Yet they fully understood that to achieve this radiant purity, someone else had to wade through literal human waste. The Roman elite solved this cognitive dissonance through extreme physical and social separation. A wealthy Roman senator would never be caught dead walking near a fullonica. If his enslaved litter-bearers were carrying him through the streets on a palanquin and they accidentally turned down a road downwind of a major laundry, he would furiously order them to turn around, burying his nose in a perfumed handkerchief or a bundle of sweet-smelling herbs. The elite wanted the gleaming final product, but they absolutely refused to acknowledge the horrific, filthy process required to create it, or the broken, foul-smelling people who actually did the work. This intense social disgust wasn't just a quiet, unspoken rule. It was a loud, popular, comedic trope. The fullones were a favorite target of mockery for ancient Roman writers, playwrights, and poets. They were the ultimate, universally understood punchline. The most famous example comes from the renowned Roman poet Martial, who wrote hundreds of short, biting, often incredibly vulgar poems called epigrams in the late 1st century A.D. Martial was the undisputed master of the ancient insult, and he frequently used the stench of the laundry workers to publicly humiliate his enemies. In one of his most vicious and famous epigrams, Martial is insulting a woman named Thais, maliciously mocking her personal hygiene and body odor. To drive home exactly how terrible she smells to his readers, he doesn't just compare her to standard garbage. He writes that she smells like a jar of stale urine broken in the middle of the street, and compares her scent directly to the fleece of a sheep freshly pulled from the fuller's vat. In another poem, he complains about a terrible host serving cheap, sour wine at a dinner party, stating that the wine is so unspeakably bad it must have been sourced directly from a fuller's street corner pea jar. For Marshall and his wealthy aristocratic readers, the fuller was the ultimate symbol of urban filth. To be compared to a laundry worker or to smell like one was the most devastating social insult imaginable. Because of this intense social isolation, the laundry workers, both free and enslaved, were largely forced to socialize only with each other. If a free laborer working in the rinsing basins wanted to get a drink after a brutal day of work, he couldn't just walk into any high-end tavern. The moment he walked through the door, the intense stench of ammonia and sulfur would clear the room. The tavern keeper would likely refuse to serve him, driving him out into the street to protect the establishment's wealthier, cleaner clientele. Instead, the Fullones frequented the lowest, grimiest, cheapest bars in the city, entirely segregated from the rest of the working class by the invisible, impenetrable barrier of their odor. Even the wealthy owners of the laundries, men like Stephanus who had amassed massive fortunes of gold and silver, could never entirely escape the stigma of their trade. This was the tragic paradox of the new money in ancient Rome. Stephanus could buy a massive patrician mansion and retrofit it into an industrial complex. He could fund the political campaigns of the city magistrates. He could afford the finest food and the most expensive imported wine. But because the source of his wealth was human waste and dirty clothes, he would never be invited to a private dinner party hosted by a true Roman aristocrat. He had all the money in the world, but he possessed absolutely no dignitas. To the old money elite, he was just a glorified peasant who had figured out how to monetize urine. This extreme class divide and total lack of respect for the laundry workers translated directly into how the Roman legal system treated them. Because the Fullones handled the most expensive, luxurious items the elite owned, the financial liability they carried every single day was absolutely staggering. The elite despised them, but they needed them, and they had absolutely no problem weaponizing the courts to crush them if a single garment was ruined. Next, we are going to dive into the chaotic, highly aggressive legal world of the Roman laundry. We will explore the specific, bizarre laws enacted solely to punish fullers, what happened when rats chewed through an expensive tunic on the drying racks, and the fascinating, deeply frustrating court cases where wealthy patricians tried to sue the men who washed their clothes into absolute bankruptcy. The Roman legal system was one of the most complex, sophisticated, and thoroughly documented frameworks in the ancient world. It serves as the absolute foundation for much of modern Western law today. When we picture Roman courts, we usually imagine massive political treason trials, dramatic assassinations, or grand imperial property disputes being argued by legendary orators. But a shocking amount of ancient legal ink was actually spilled over dirty laundry. Because the Fullones handled the most valuable, luxurious items the elite owned, they operated their businesses in a constant state of extreme legal jeopardy. To understand why the laundry owners were sued so frequently and why the stakes were so incredibly high, you have to understand the staggering financial value of the garments they were washing. Today, clothing is relatively cheap, mass-produced, and easily disposable. In ancient Rome, clothing was a massive financial investment, but every single piece of fabric was spun and woven entirely by hand, a painstakingly slow process that took weeks or even months for a single standard garment. If a senator handed a fuller a heavy winter cloak dyed with Tyrian purple, a magnificent, deeply saturated dye extracted from the rotting glands of thousands of predatory sea snails, which was literally worth more than its weight in solid gold. That single cloak might be worth more than the entire fullonica and everyone working inside it. When a Roman citizen handed their garments over to a fuller, they didn't just drop them off. They entered into a highly specific, legally binding contract known in Roman law as locatio conductio operis, which translates roughly to the letting and hiring of a piece of work. Under this rigid legal framework, the fuller assumed a heavy burden of responsibility known as custodia. This meant absolute, strict liability for the safekeeping of the item. From the exact moment the dirty toga crossed the threshold of the laundry until the moment it was safely returned to the client's villa, perfectly pressed and brilliantly white, the laundry owner was financially responsible for absolutely everything that happened to it. There were very few excuses accepted in a Roman court. And in a bustling, chaotic, ancient metropolis like Rome, a lot of terrible things could happen to a pile of expensive fabric. Rome was a city deeply plagued by extreme wealth inequality, which meant it was also a city with a massive, uncontrollable population of opportunistic thieves, known in Latin as fures. If a laundry worker finished washing a beautiful, highly expensive Egyptian linen tunic and hung it out to dry on the open-air roof terrace to catch the afternoon sun, and a thief managed to scale the exterior wall and steal it in the middle of the night, the wealthy client did not bear the loss. The client would simply take the fuller to court. The Roman magistrates overwhelmingly ruled that the fuller had to pay the client the full estimated value of the stolen garment out of his own pocket. The legal reasoning was simple and ruthless. The fuller had failed in his legal duty of custodia to properly guard the premises, and therefore the financial loss was entirely his fault. But the legal liabilities went far beyond simple theft by humans. The Roman jurists, the ancient equivalent of Supreme Court justices who wrote massive, multi-volume commentaries dictating how the law should be applied, actually debated specific, highly bizarre hypothetical cases involving the day-to-day operations of the laundries. One of the most famous and highly specific legal rulings involves a problem that plagued every single ancient city: rodents. Rome had a massive, uncontrollable rat and mouse problem. If you ran a laundry where hundreds of heavy, warm wool garments were constantly stacked in dark, humid corners waiting to be washed, those piles of clothes were prime real estate for nesting rodents looking for shelter and nesting materials. The famous Roman jurist Ulpian, whose extensive legal writings form a massive part of the Justinian Code that survived the fall of the empire, specifically addressed this exact scenario. He decreed that if a client's clothes were gnawed on or chewed through by mice while sitting in the fullonica, the fuller was completely financially liable for the ruined garment. The legal reasoning was brutal but logical within their system. It was the fuller's legal obligation to actively prevent mice from entering his shop, perhaps by keeping a designated laundry cat, and failing to do so was considered an act of professional negligence. Then there was the problem of the actual washing process itself. We have already covered just how physically violent and chemically aggressive the Roman laundry process was. It was a delicate, dangerous tightrope walk. If an exhausted, enslaved worker left an expensive tunic in the highly alkaline ammonia vat for slightly too long, the caustic chemicals would literally eat through the threads, permanently weakening the fabric. If the worker beat a delicate linen garment too hard with a wooden mallet against the stone basins during the rinse cycle and tore it, or if they accidentally let a sulfur fire get out of control in the bleaching courtyard and singed the edge of a pristine white toga, the owner of the laundry was instantly legally liable for the full replacement cost. Perhaps the most common legal dispute arose from the sheer, chaotic volume of clothes moving through the massive industrial laundries on a daily basis. Imagine a massive fullonica in Pompeii processing thousands of garments a week. Without modern tags, every white toga looks relatively similar to every other white toga. If the overworked slaves mixed up the orders and accidentally gave a wealthy patrician's high-quality, ultra-soft, inexpensive wool toga to a middle-class merchant, and gave the merchant's scratchy, lower-quality toga to the patrician, it wasn't just a simple customer service error that could be fixed with an apology. It was grounds for a vicious, immediate lawsuit. Roman jurists actively debated whether giving the wrong cloak back to a customer constituted actual intentional theft or just a severe breach of contract. Regardless of the legal technicality they settled on, the fuller was dragged out of his shop and into the basilicas, the grand cavernous public law courts of Rome, to face the wrath of an insulted aristocrat. And in these courtrooms, the power dynamic was incredibly, unfairly skewed. If a wealthy, influential senator decided to sue a local fuller over a ruined Tyrian purple cloak or a missing tunic, the fuller was at a massive, an almost insurmountable disadvantage. The senator had the immense personal wealth to hire the finest, most eloquent, and most aggressive lawyers in Rome, men with the rhetorical skill of the famous orator Cicero. The senator had powerful political friends in the judiciary. The fuller, despite his localized wealth and the power of his guild, was still viewed with the deep, visceral social disgust we discussed earlier. The judges, who were themselves members of the elite patrician class, heavily favored their wealthy, sweet-smelling peers over the foul-smelling, socially inferior tradesmen. A single aggressive lawsuit over a ruined silk garment or a stolen luxury cloak could completely bankrupt a mid-sized laundry. It could force the owner to liquidate his entire business, selling off his specialized pressing equipment, his masonry vats, and even his enslaved workers just to pay the court-ordered legal damages. To survive this terrifying legal minefield, the fullonicas had to implement incredibly strict, meticulous tracking systems. They developed complex inventory methods, attaching small lead tags to the garments or weaving tiny, highly specific identifying marks into the hems as soon as they arrived to prevent catastrophic mix-ups. They hired armed guards to watch the drying terraces at night to deter thieves. They lived in constant, grinding fear of a single, highly expensive mistake that could cost them everything. But while the male owners dealt with the lawsuits, the politicians, and the guilds, and while the male slaves stomped endlessly in the brutal ammonia vats, there was an entirely different, an almost completely invisible demographic working in the shadows of the Roman laundry industry. The historical records, the legal texts, and the vivid frescoes of Pompeii reveal that the fullonica was not exclusively a brotherhood of misery. It was heavily populated by women. Next, we are going to shine a light on the hidden female workforce of the ancient Roman laundromat. We will explore the specific, highly skilled jobs women performed in the finishing rooms, the societal expectations placed upon them, and how they survived in one of the most toxic, male-dominated industrial environments of the ancient world. When we think of the brutal physical labor of the Roman laundry, the men stomping endlessly in the ammonia vats, the violent beating of heavy clothes against stone basins, on the suffocating clouds of sulfur gas, it is easy to picture the fullonica as an exclusively male hellscape. However, the archaeological record, ancient legal texts, and the vivid, perfectly preserved frescoes of Pompeii tell a much more complex and nuanced story. The Roman laundry industry was actually heavily reliant on a massive, highly skilled, and almost entirely invisible female workforce. Women, both enslaved and free, were absolutely essential to the operation of a successful fullonica, though they were often sequestered away from the most physically violent, squelching vats in the back courtyards. Their roles were deeply tied to the meticulous, high-stakes finishing processes. Once a garment survived the chemical trauma of the ammonia, the abrasive clay, and the sulfur bleaching, it was essentially a stiff, tangled, and deeply traumatized mess of wool. It was here, in the finishing rooms at the front of the shop, that the female workers took over. One of their primary, highly skilled jobs was structural mending. If you are about to wash a heavy wool cloak that already has a small tear or a frayed hem, throwing it into a cascading rinse basin and hitting it with heavy wooden mallets will instantly rip the garment in half, resulting in the massive financial lawsuits we discussed earlier. Women were tasked with meticulously inspecting every single garment upon arrival. Using small bronze needles and rough wool threads, they sewed up minor tears and secured loose hems before the washing process even began, silently saving the laundry owners from total financial ruin on a daily basis. Furthermore, women were heavily involved in the delicate washing of the most dangerous luxury fabrics. When those terrifyingly expensive, gossamer-thin silk stolas arrived from the patrician estates, they were almost never thrown to the men in the stomping vats. They were handed directly to the women. Instead of using the highly alkaline, fabric-destroying fermented urine, the women carefully hand-washed these silks in gentle botanical solutions made from crushed soapwort. They had to gently press the dirt out of the delicate threads without ever twisting, stretching, or tearing the fabric. The women also managed the exhausting carding process, meticulously dragging those spiky, dried hedgehog skins across the damp wool to raise the nap and make it soft again. And finally, they were the ones who expertly folded the massive, unwieldy 18-foot togas into the perfect razor-sharp pleats required before the garments were loaded into the crushing wooden screw presses. But despite performing slightly less physically destructive labor, these women were still trapped inside the exact same deeply toxic environment as the men. They breathed the same concentrated ammonia vapor that constantly wafted in from the back rooms. They were exposed to the same suffocating sulfur dioxide gas. They suffered the same chronic respiratory illnesses, the same stinging eyes, and they carried the exact same inescapable, foul-smelling social stigma when they walked out into the streets. For enslaved women in the fullonica, the nightmare was uniquely compounded by the intense vulnerability of their position. They were completely at the mercy of the wealthy male owners, the aggressive overseers, and the harsh, unforgiving daily quotas of an industrial sweatshop. So, with all of this institutionalized misery, how did this horrific, urine-soaked industrial complex finally come to an end? The answer lies in the catastrophic, world-altering collapse of the Roman Empire itself. The massive industrial-scale fullonicas were entirely dependent on the highly complex, interconnected infrastructure of the empire. They desperately needed the uninterrupted, high-pressure flow of millions of gallons of water from the aqueducts. They needed the international maritime shipping routes to bring in thousands of tons of volcanic fuller's earth from Sardinia and the Greek islands. And most importantly, they needed the massive, hyper-concentrated urban populations to provide the endless, free supply of human waste. When the Western Roman Empire began to fracture, burn, and fall in the 5th century A.D., that fragile infrastructure shattered. Invading armies, like the Ostrogoths, in 537 A.D., systematically besieged Rome and actively cut the grand aqueducts to starve the city of water, instantly and permanently shutting off the high-pressure rinse cycles of the laundries. The international trade routes collapsed into piracy and chaos, making it impossible to import the specialized bleaching clay. And as the city of Rome was repeatedly sacked, burned, and starved, its population plummeted from over 1 million people to a mere fraction of that size. The massive public latrines went completely dry. The complex, highly organized, immensely wealthy guild of the fullones simply could not survive the death of the city that birthed them. The ancient laundromat went extinct. As the Roman methods faded into the Dark Ages, Europe turned to a completely different, much older, and vastly less disgusting chemical solution. For centuries, the Celtic and Germanic tribes living on the wild fringes of the empire had been utilizing a primitive, highly effective mixture of boiled animal fat, tallow, and caustic beechwood ash. The Romans had actually known about this substance. The historian Pliny the Elder even wrote about it, calling it sapo, but they generally dismissed it as a crude barbarian hair pomade rather than a serious laundry detergent. However, as the Roman supply chains collapsed and the urine vats dried up, this barbarian concoction, which we now know as true, sudsy soap, finally took over Europe. It was incredibly easy to make locally. It didn't require massive international trade networks, and most importantly, it didn't require fleets of carts collecting human waste from street corners. The violent fall of Rome was a massive geopolitical catastrophe that plunged Europe into centuries of darkness. But for the invisible, suffering workers of the laundry vats, it marked the permanent end of an agonizing industrial era. The story of the Roman fullonica is the ultimate necessary reality check on our highly romanticized view of the ancient world. When we walk through modern air-conditioned museums, or when we watch massive Hollywood historical epics, we are consistently presented with an incredibly curated, sanitized version of history. We see the gleaming white marble temples reflecting the sun. We hear the brilliant philosophical debates of the Senate. We marvel at the emperors draped in pristine, radiant white togas. We are trained from childhood to view the Roman Empire as the absolute pinnacle of ancient civilization, an era of unparalleled hygiene, architectural order, and intellectual purity. But that radiant purity was a deliberate, manufactured illusion. And like all illusions in the ancient world, it was paid for in blood, sweat, and intense human suffering. The blinding whiteness of a senator's toga was not a reflection of his moral character or his divine right to rule. It was the direct physical result of thousands of impoverished, enslaved, and utterly marginalized people wading through vats of fermented bodily fluids. It was bought with the chemically burned skin, the permanently ruined lungs, and the agonizing, squelching labor of the absolute lowest untouchables in Roman society. The next time you look at a majestic marble statue of Augustus Caesar or marvel at the brilliant, pristine columns of an ancient Roman temple, take a moment to look a little closer. Look past the glory, the gold, and the military conquests. Remember the dark, humid, echoing back rooms of Pompeii. Remember the choking, eye-watering smell of ammonia and burning sulfur. Remember that behind every single symbol of supreme power and pristine cleanliness in the ancient world, there was a hidden, silent army of people forced to endure the absolute worst filth imaginable just to keep up appearances. The Roman Empire was undeniably brilliant and its engineering was unmatched, but at its core, it was also incredibly, profoundly disgusting. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the hidden, putrid reality of the ancient world. If you made it all the way through this horrific journey and you never want to look at a pristine white toga the same way again, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know down in the comments what weird, dark, or entirely boring part of history we should uncover next. Until next time, be thankful for your modern washing machine, and we will see you in the next video.